Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Inside Security EMEA. My name's Sam Humphreys. I will be your compere for the day. On the webinar today, we have Jessica Jolliton and Al Scott, who are going to present to you Smarter SOC, how Exabeam can help your security operations team. So if you are a CPE person, you can self-report. Details will be in your ISC squared handbook. Okay, we're running a passport to prizes over the 2 days of the event. The more you interact with, the more options or more points you'll get, and points equal prize draw entries. You can win some AirPods Pro, a Nintendo Switch Lite, or indeed an Amazon gift voucher. So you can see on the screen here the different points you'll get for the different interactions that you can do. After you've attended this webinar, if you'd like to have a chat with one of our representatives in the virtual booth, or indeed check out some of the content in the content section, all of those interactions will equal entries into the prize draw. And if you haven't already done so, please do register for our charity event. We've got some excellent speakers. James Birdseye, who is the most amazing chap. He's a paramedic. He's a self-confessed security geek. We have a Q&A panel where you'll be able to ask questions directly to Exabeam customers. And then you'll be entertained by the amazing folks, the beer farmers, if you've never seen before, are a staple on the security community B-side circuit. They're very smart, they're very funny, well worth a visit. For everyone who attends, we will be contributing to charity. You can choose your charity of choice, be that UNICEF's Global COVID-19 Emergency Appeal or NHS Charities Together. So you can register for that where all of the other theatre sessions are. And obviously, of course, you can register for the other theatre sessions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jess and Al.
Thanks, Sam. So we want to get started with a little bit of an introduction about us so you can kind of see the faces behind the voices. We will definitely not be putting our cameras on, mainly because I'm sat here in my daytime pajamas and Al's hair is actually about a foot longer now that from that picture. So I'm Jess. I've got a background in SOC, relatively new to the Exabeam family, but absolutely loving it. And Al?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So Alistair, been here at Exabeam for 18 months now. It's flying by, but been in security since about 2001. Thanks, Jess.
So the first topic we're going to be looking at is a process that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and many of you have had a few issues with. What we're really going to be looking at is the sort of classic manual way of working in a SOC. So the first thing that typically needs to be done manually when we think about dealing with logs and sim life is we have to manually configure the rules in the sim. We have to define thresholds, and then we have this constant need to tune these rules to make sure that they become more effective, we improve them over time, and we sort of reduce any false positives that can be created. Then when we have activity in the logs that matches these rules conditions, alerts are generated. And depending on how good your rules are, how much tuning's been done, sort of how mature your environment is, there's probably about a 50% chance that alert is actually a false positive. That's a stat from the HelpNet security survey of SOC analysts. They also have some quite interesting information around the fact that year on year, the time it takes to investigate each alert and also the amount of alerts coming through are increasing. Already building a picture where we've got quite a lot of alerts there. So we know what the problems that a mountain of alerts brings. You have alert fatigue. So if we have lots of different alerts, it's very difficult to see through things that are just noise to things that are actually really important and actually do need that investigative work. The sheer volume, if you cannot get through all of those alerts in a day, they either roll over or they just sort of disappear into a black hole. Quite often, SOCs just don't have the capacity to get through all of the alerts that they have in a day. Also, incredibly boring going through a lot of false positives. Day in, day out, triaging the same alerts, you're probably going to miss things. And it's also, people probably didn't decide that they wanted a career in cybersecurity to sit there and look at these screens of alerts. There's a reason why so many analysts change roles so often, sheer boredom usually, trying to find someone new and exciting, maybe a more mature SOC to work in where they've been able to implement some automation. On automation, there has been an increase of the use of automation to fight some of these pain points, but If you don't do automation well, you're causing the same amount of problems. If you automatically escalated all of your alerts to a case management or a SOC platform, you basically then got those alerts in two separate places. So you need to apply things like automation on initial triage and evidence gathering in order to sort of balance out that mountain of alerts that you've then sent over and sort of see through the noise and clear out some of those false positives. Or what you'll do is you'll give your incident responders a bit of a mini heart attack. We need to add that context to those alerts so we know what an alert means internally and we know what it means to sort of the outside world as well. If we move on to gathering evidence, then this is typically something that is extremely manual and time consuming. This usually involves logging into several different tools to gather information, querying for info, understanding how that query language works, copy and pasting a lot of information, and also using everybody's favorite SOC tool, Notepad, to then copy and paste all of that information in as your repository. When you have all of your evidence, provided it's not a false positive, then you need to piece together a timeline of activity. What's happened? Where did they go next? What kind of activity is around all of these different parts of the information that you've gathered together? And these timelines are necessary for things like audits, especially if what you're dealing with ends up being sort of ending in a data breach. These are the kind of things that you would need to provide for like GDPR purposes. Again, this is hugely time consuming. One of our colleagues actually wrote a recent blog that's quite interesting. It's a nice, easy read. He went through the manual process of building an incident timeline using a legacy SIM, won't name any names. And it took him over 20 hours to piece together the timeline for just like a simple malware alert, nothing too complex, nothing highly sort of APT. But definitely go have a read. We'll chuck a link somewhere in the information after the session. But you definitely don't want to have to take 20 hours to sort of piece together what has happened if you've got malware in your system, especially when that mountain of alerts is just kind of growing in the background. You need to get back to fixing those as well. And that's all before you even start responding. So there's quite a significant amount of manual and complex things that you need to do first. I appreciate that I've painted a very bleak picture of working in a SOC onto sort of more positive things. Let's have a look at how Exabeam can use some of its unique features to improve those incident lifecycle and reduce those false positives and give your analysts time to do things like training or super exciting things like threat hunting. Most SOCs are too bogged down with sort of dealing with all of those alerts to even get to do things like, right, let's go have a look, take that information and do some threat hunting. So the first thing that we do differently, before that alert mounting gets generated, Exabeam will apply behavior analytics for users and entities. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on any of these points because I don't want to distract from Al's demo, where he'll be covering all of these in detail, but I'm just going to give you a quick high level of what Exabeam does at each of these points. So pretty much every single major cyber attack has at some point had valid credentials exploited. And this is because it's very difficult to use traditional SIM rules to detect when a malicious actor could be using these valid credentials. We actually run a cyber capabilities assessment, and 80% of the organizations that we surveyed said that they could not detect if there were compromised credentials in their environment. And 3/4 of them said that they had zero ability to detect things like APTs, your low and slow attacks, and anything that sort of is using these compromised credentials. So it means that they can do lateral movement, they can move around, they could do data collection, data exfiltration, without sort of generating any alarm bells, and generally just have a party in your environment. And we definitely don't want that. Moving on to automated alert prioritization. Exabeam takes that behavior, adds risk to it, and then you basically work on those with the highest level of risk. Al is definitely going to go into a lot more detail on that in a minute. Then we have automated timelines. So think back to that 20+ hours for a simple malware alert. We want to completely get rid of that, and we want it to be minutes, not hours. And Al's going to go through that in a lot more detail. You're going to see one of those automated timelines in action. And then once we know what's happened, we can send that over to case management and we can begin to perform some automated actions in order to do response. So things like, oh, let's send this out to sandbox, or let's perform some threat intelligence, maybe send some notification to different teams. If you are interested in hearing a bit more about how Exabeam handles SOAR, one of our colleagues, Andy, will be running a whole session on SOAR, and there'll be details on how to register for that event afterwards as well. So now that you've heard my power talking, I'm going to hand over to Al, who is going to walk you through a demo of that sort of new Exabeam way of working that I just discussed.
Thanks, Jess. Exabeam provides a full security management platform that comprises of log collection, so your traditional SIM. We have the case management and incident response, so part of what Jess was talking there around the SOAR capability as well. And then we have Exabeam's advanced analytics. So for the demo, so we're going to focus on this part, on what advanced analytics can basically do. So we're going to walk you through how Exabeam improves that process of investigation and detection using the technologies that Jess has just mentioned. So basically looking at machine learning and automation, and how this helps the SOC. That will give them the ability to do a lot more in a short amount of time and help them answer those very complex and hard questions that does take a lot of time to dig out using a traditional SIM, and is ultimately responsible for what most analysts are struggling with day in and day out, and why we do hear that alert fatigue and about that. This is Exabeam's advanced analytics platform. It is tightly integrated with our case management and incident responder, basically makes collecting artifacts and evidence more intuitive and seamless. And then as we come down here, we see what we call notable users and other watch lists of users and assets. And what this is all about basically is Exabeam helping the SOC prioritize time. For example, rather than saying every security alert needs to be investigated, which takes time and effort and is mostly a manual process for most, again, that point really around alert fatigue, Exabeam scores unknown or unexpected behavior with subset of risk points. We're looking holistically at the behaviors of users and entities, what they're exhibiting, and then we're adding anomalies to enrich that picture. And that's what we're starting to see here. We're seeing the risk score that we're basically starting to attribute to that activity. When a risk score for a user or an entity asset reaches 90 points or more, then they become notable. They would appear here. And we can also integrate that into the case management part of the platform as well. But before I carry on and we start saying a bit more about how Exabeam can help you quickly triage and investigate one of these focal points, shall we say, notable users or assets, I'd like to show you a little bit more about what's going on when we talk about behavior and analytics. And we'll look at this actually as well further through the demo as well. But what we can start to do and show you here is, for example, we're building models around what is normal behavior, actually understanding what a user would do in this instance when it comes to VPN. Where would they come in from? So here I can take a look, and these are all the models that are being built from the log data that is being produced by your VPN head ends or firewalls, etc. It's being collected by Exabeam's advanced analytics and processed to actually learn and understand what is normal behavior for these users. And each one of these, like I said, we're collecting and building this for every single user in your organization automatically. There's no creation of a lot of these models. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but we're getting a picture basically about what is normal. And it's quite topical as well, given a lot of home working now, people remote working because of COVID, etc. To give you another example of perhaps another model, we can just look at this one here. This is now perhaps is going to start looking around activity when it comes to assets on your network, which users are using those assets, those servers that you have. Again, the reason I brought this one up, and just to quickly show you this one, is a lot of organizations struggle to understand lateral movement. So when there is a threat actor inside the network, perhaps how they're moving from one asset to another. Exabeam here, by building this picture around what users use which assets, when we start to basically understand abnormal behavior, it makes it pretty easy actually to understand and see lateral movement when it's happening. The final model, before we actually get back, we'll start looking at some more of the demonstration for you. Just want to bring up this particular model. And this is just to show you time now as well. So when we're building models, the few I've just very quickly shown you are looking at source information, i.e. where users are coming from. The other one was in terms of destination, which resources they users, where they're going to. And this one here is particularly at what time. So here we're already starting to show that we can build models around what is normal behavior in terms of what they're accessing, when they're accessing, etc. And there are hundreds of these models that we provide for users, assets, peer groups, which again we'll talk about in a moment, as well as organizational level ones that come straight out of the box. You don't have to go creating any of these, and this will help you get value very quickly, where Exabeam will learn and basically, as I mentioned, understand what is normal without having you to think about creating correlation rules as you have had to be doing, and then managing those, feeding and watering those correlation rules. And like I said, just to make that point, these models, they've been created for every user, for every asset automatically. And just mentioning it as well in terms of correlation rules and just touching on that point again, correlation rules can only really be designed to cater for known variables. So basically, if we see A and then perhaps B scenarios, then we're going to generate an alert from that. Whereas when we're looking at modeling here and understanding when there is abnormal behavior, Exabeam can detect the unknown, including APTs where there may be no signatures. The IOCs, the dynamic nature of their type of activity, basically renders correlation rules effectively pretty much useless.
Just to add, it takes approximately 2 weeks to kind of establish a baseline of activity. And then we would say 4 weeks to get a really strong picture of what is normal behavior and then be able to see what is really not normal behavior.
Also, the last thing to say is that on this particular point is by showing this as well, it demonstrates that Exabeam is not a black box. Everything is accessible, but it's also extensible here. So if there are unique requirements inside your organization, say there's an in-house developed application that has privileged or critical data within it, then models can easily be reused, as in what's already coming out of the box, or they can be created if necessary to say then learn who's accessing that application of yours, when they access it, and where from. So this can all be modeled and then risk applied when abnormal behavior is seen. Anyway, let's go back to the dashboard. We're going to run through an investigation and we're going to start to bring a bit more about what we're doing here with modeling as well for you. So as we look back down here, let's say we have our notable users. We're just going to pick on one to go and have a look at, and we'll go and look at Barbara Salazar here. Now, the first thing I see here is this information card, and this gives me context of who I'm investigating. And we'll basically be able to populate this from directory services, things like Active Directory. And from here, immediately, I can now start to see more information, whereas typically perhaps with an alert, I'd only have a username, or perhaps I would only have a very limited subset of information. But immediately as the analyst, I can see her full name, her job title, where she's located, and her department. And this helps, because it gives me more information as an analyst. And I can see some other information as well, including peer groups. And why this is useful to us as well is, again, is about context. So we were able to also compare behavior when we're looking from a risk perspective, not just of Barbara, but other users within inside her context that she works with. So, for example, perhaps using similar application, perhaps it's going to be based on location. So now after we have a little bit more information about the user and we have that additional context, so we've already been able to answer questions that an analyst typically would be having to start to ask before they even started, we can see here that we have that case management. So if you are using Exabeam's case management, we can now see that there are already some incidents that are open for her. So this gives me as the analyst the capability to perhaps go and have a quick look at that case, perhaps go and have a conversation with the analyst that's taking a look at there. Now, looking down through here as well, we can start to understand risk. We mentioned that what Exabeam is helping you do is understand risk more than just looking at alerts. So what we can do here is actually look at the risk timeline for our user as well. And what we're seeing here is basically sessions. So a session here, as we see represented by a dot here, is effectively it's a day in the life of that user. So from the moment they first log in, or perhaps they've badged into the office or VPN'd in, we're able to then start stitching all of the different log activity that's been fed into the Exabeam analytics platform. So all those proxy logs, email logs, etc. That's all stitched into these sessions. And this will include not only the abnormal behavior that's observed, but also the normal behavior. Now, when we start thinking about looking at incidents as well and doing an investigation, An investigation in some situations, yes, you're just looking at a day, but in some situations as well, it's going to be a much broader timescale. You're going to be looking much further back in time. Sometimes, depending on the nature of breach, 30, 45 days or more. And this becomes really challenging to look through the raw log data using a SIEM tool to do that. In many cases, when you're looking at such a broad investigation or involve multiple members of the SOC, but what I can do here very easily is I can pivot and actually have a look back, even as much as a year if I need to actually understand and look at the session data. So basically all of that activity for that user. So here we could see before from a risk profile point of view that this user was pretty normal until we've seen this sudden change in risk behavior. So again, as an analyst here now, I can start to say, yes, I definitely need to continue to look through this and actually understand what is happening. Now, looking again further down this particular view here, we can see the risk reasons. So we had that risk score where the user became notable, and we saw it was 266 points of risk. But like I said, what we're not going to do is alert you every time an anomaly is detected, but score that subset of risk points, which we can start to see here. And we aggregate that risk across that session for that user. And as I mentioned earlier, when that risk score reaches 90 points or more, that's when that user becomes notable. But again, Exabeam is an extensible platform. You can make changes to basically meet your business requirements. So if there were certain things that required more risk applying to certain activity types based on your business, or perhaps when a user becomes notable, then that is entirely possible as well. Now, just by reading through a few of these anomalies and knowing that Barbara already has some open incidents, has already got a high risk score, yes, I know I want to do a deeper investigation. Now, something that a SOC should do for every investigation is really create a timeline. Make sure that everything about that incident is fully understood. But without Exabeam, creating a timeline is a manual process. So they often aren't or can't due to time, number of alerts to triage, etc., KPIs that they're trying to meet, etc. It's sometimes just not practical to do that. But what Exabeam is doing automatically for every user is creating a timeline. And we're doing this for every user every day. But what makes these timelines smart is Exabeam's ability to tie a host to an IP address at any given time and understand which user has presence on that host, even if that user device basically ends up with multiple IP addresses, perhaps because of moving around a campus, etc. And we can stitch all of this information together. So as an analyst, I don't actually have to go through and first identify what user was on what host and what IP address before I even start my investigation. And there's another way I'm going to show that to you later on as well in terms of our capability to do that host to IP mapping and also user to asset mapping as well. So if we start to look down through the timeline here, we can see that it's all been built in a chronological order for us. It includes potentially normal as well as the abnormal behavior.
It's also worth mentioning that this timeline in particular is made up of several different log sources. So it's pulling information in from VPN logs, Windows logs, proxy logs, database audit logs, and then also layering in the security alerts as well. So if you imagine you had to go and pull all of these tiny bits of information, for example, from the VPN log, and then document it all, you can begin to see the real time saving that these smart timelines actually will give you.
Thanks, Jess. So the first thing that we see here within the timeline is this VPN login. And we can actually expand this out, have a little bit more of a look into it. And we can see that the source where this came from, so in this case, it was from a Juniper VPN. Exabeam, we can ingest log sources from many different platforms. In fact, we've got hundreds, if not thousands of parsers, again, just out of the box to be able to bring in and ingest this data. That raw log data would obviously included the source IP address, but what we've also done is been able to enrich that data. So in this case, we've been able to identify the country, the source where that's come from. So again, another question that's already been answered for the analyst here. But as we look across over just to here, we now get to see all the different anomalous activity that's been identified just actually from this one log. So again, we're just coming back onto that point around the models and what we're doing to understand what is normal behavior. And here we can see that it's a first time activity for the country Ukraine for Barbara. We've never seen Barbara VPN in from this location before. So again, just to think about some of those data models that I showed you earlier, they were very broad, obviously looking at all of the different data models we were building for all users. By clicking on this link here, we actually go specifically just into Barbara's own data model when it comes to VPN usage. And here we can see that she would typically come from the United States. We've never seen her come from the Ukraine before. Now, again, often what is done here when an analyst is going through the triage and investigation, they would do further queries just to validate, that correlation alert may be to say, I've seen this activity. So is this normal? Is this abnormal? What Exabeam is also doing is you can go and look at the current model. You can see if it's actually been updated since that anomaly was generated. And here we can see that it hasn't. So in this instance, because it's a first-time activity here, we've applied that 20 points of risk for this particular type of anomaly. We can also see here that it's the first time for the organizational level to see activity from the Ukraine. So again, that point about the models that we're building out here, as well as at the user level, let's say it's at the organizational level, but creating these rules at the user level, the way that we do, or the models rather, it's giving you a level of granularity and visibility that again is very challenging to achieve, if not again impossible to do with correlation rules. Whereas typically you'd see a correlation rule built at this kind of level. As we come further down through here, we can start to see some first activity from this ISP, which is to be expected, given that we've never seen that country before. But also what's interesting here now is the first time we've ever seen this asset used by Barbara or even the organization. Again, as we continue to look down through here, we can see that there's a risk transfer from a past session. Now, what this basically means is that we've seen risk identified in a previous session for this user, but it wasn't enough to become notable. So we transfer a part of that risk identified in that session across to the next one. And that's to really help catch those low and slow type of attacks. But again, what I can do now as the analyst, because I would then start to say, well, I want to understand what's happened, because again, it's perhaps going to help me understand what's going on here, is I can scroll back up. Because these timelines have been automatically generated for me, again, there's no need to go off and start creating queries to understand this and obviously the time and effort that would entail. Here we can see that there was a Palo Alto alert that was generated on this asset, and we can go and look at this asset. Again, this is the part of the modeling. And this is where we can now see who is actually the real user of an asset. So we're not reliant on a CMDB. We can actually learn this information from the actual log data that's being produced. And here we can see that this is her asset. Now, typically knowing how malware is being distributed or et cetera, or how alerts come into the organization, it's going to be via web or email. Those are typically the main vectors. So I can see here in the timeline, because it's built out for me, that there was an email received. And I can now expand this. I can go and have a look here. I've got the sender information. But what strikes me straight away is I've got a very suspicious looking subject line, and I also have a payload attached to this. So this tells me that I've most likely got a phishing-like email. And unfortunately, Barbara has probably clicked on a link that was contained within that, though more likely she's executed the payload in this instance. As we look down through here now, what this now tells me is that, and I can say this with a reasonable amount of confidence, is that we have a compromised credential situation, because we now understand what's happened. We saw the activity from the VPN. We've been able to see that there was some activity on the previous session, and now we have a threat actor that's basically remoted into the network using our VPN, and now has gained access. So as I look down through further into the timeline, and I come and look here at 11:01, I can see the remote access to our asset. We know it's an asset. And again, this makes sense because this is where the infection started from effectively. So this is the landing point for the threat actor. As we look down through here now, we start to see some other what is potentially normal activity. Again, this has probably been learned from the asset, but is this effectively the start of the reconnaissance and then the lateral movement inside our network. Again, we're starting to see first access to resources that Barbara has never accessed before. Again, thinking about those models that we're building around which assets that she would normally use, we've been able to identify using that modeling, the lateral movement that would typically be very challenging to actually learn and understand using a typical SIEM. As we come down through here, we're coming down, we can see some other firsts. We've got a first for most log on to a service. And probably at this stage, what we're seeing here is a credential switch. So probably at this point, additional credentials have been learned. And if I just expand this, we just get a little bit more information around this particular type of activity. And obviously getting hold of these credentials, this is what allows, to Jess's point earlier, allows threat actors to basically move around your network with often limited capabilities to be actually tracked and understood using traditional tool sets. Because they're also using valid credentials, you don't have to break the lock if you've got the keys to it.
What I also really love about this is, Al, if you just click back open on that, if you were sort of more junior analyst looking through this, the description that Exabeam provides here is really helpful to help the person, the analyst investigating, understand why there is risk score attributed to this. So this is a notable event because privileged credentials often have access to sensitive information, and it sort of helps analysts understand why that would be 40 points of risk associated with this particular bit of activity.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Moving on down through the timeline here. With those additional credentials now as well, we've got some other firsts, so we're jumping across. And what we're able to do here now as well, because we've seen the use of those additional credentials used that have been learned, we're still able to stitch this back to Barbara, because this user is purporting now to be Barbara. So we're able to basically consolidate this within Barbara's timeline, but we have the context. We understand that this isn't Barbara. This is a threat actor using those additional privileges now and credentials to move around the network. So then further down, we see at 1500 hours, there's been no remote log on to an SQL server. And because we're also in this particular instance, bringing in the audit data from our database service, possibly because this is a particularly sensitive server with this type of data, given that it has payroll information stored on it, we're able then to pick out the logon activity. We can even start to bring in the queries that are being executed as well. So you can start to see that information, again, providing the context for the analyst as they investigate. As we come down through here, we also have the proxy logs that have been ingested, and we can start to see activity. In this case, we're now seeing an upload activity. So this is basically looking like as we're moving through the exfiltration stage now. And ultimately, we do have an alert that's been generated by our Palo Altos, in this case for a large amount of outbound traffic that's been sent. Again, this type of alert sometimes, when we start thinking about being able to focus and understand where analysts need to spend their time, this type of alert is one of those that often generates a fair number of false positives. So sometimes maybe closed down rather quickly without being fully investigated. But Exabeam here, because we have the context of what's gone on, we can basically see that, this has now been part of the exfiltration. But this particular alert may still be the point of when the investigation would start from. We certainly do appreciate that whilst we're obviously providing this risk view around analyzing threats inside the organization, there may still be situations where an alert that's been generated will be the focal point, that would be the starting point of investigation. So what Exabeam can do here, and again, this is coming back to some of the points I was making earlier around being able to stitch IP to host information and user to host information together. With these type of security alerts, they only contain a partial piece of information. It may just have the host, it may just have the IP address, etc. But using that technology and being able to join this information together across all the disparate different types of log sources that are coming in, we can basically understand who those security alerts were applicable to. So say that incident did arrive in case management just with that particular alert ID, and an analyst needed to basically go off and quickly triage that. Using part of our threat hunting capability, which we'll talk a little bit more on in a moment as well, we can go and search just for that security alert. And here immediately, because again, I've been able to stitch this information together, we can see exactly which user this was applicable to. We can see the time when this was around. Obviously, again, that information is probably going to be inside the alert itself, but we can also see the risk associated with inside that session. And if I click on it, and if you imagine you hadn't seen the timeline that we just worked through a moment ago, we're able to go straight into that timeline. So again, from a time and effort for the analyst here, when it comes to understanding these alerts and basically the importance of them and having focus, we're actually able to, through automation, very quickly help them understand what happened around that alert, including afterwards and prior to it, because, again, just to make that point, Exabeam is automatically creating all of these smart timelines for you. So the last thing I'm just going to show you briefly, and just because I mentioned it around being able to use Threat Hunter to look at that security ID, I just want to have a quick talk around this capability. And what this is because of hopefully what you're starting to see through the automation that Exabeam can provide with creation of those timelines, basically helping work through the triage, the investigation, and basically it's saving you time. Exabeam is giving you time back from those manual investigations. This now allows the SOC to look for and discover activity which may not have been notable yet, or perhaps part of a more sophisticated attack that's going on, etc. So the way to start actually looking inside the data that Exabeam Analytics actually holds. But also let's talk about why it's different to traditional threat hunting. Here you'd use your traditional SIM or even Exabeam's own data lake, so that log collection, to do this. And that's very much search query orientated. And it's often really only performed by your most experienced analysts, because it does take a lot of training and knowledge and experience to effectively become a really good threat hunter. Exabeam Threat Hunter basically uses a structured format though, and this does open up threat hunting to more of the members of the SOC team. And it perhaps even helps you start threat hunting if you're not already doing this today. And the other thing to mention about our approach to it, which we're going to dig through a little bit more here now, is it brings consistency to the approach as well, because analysts often do have slightly different ways that they would approach these things, the ways, the tools that they would use, perhaps the queries that they would execute as well. So this way, you always make sure that you have a consistent approach to this. And the other thing as well, just don't want you to forget, is that Exabeam keeps this risk and anomaly and session data for up to a year. So this may help negate or remove the need for long data retention periods at the SIM log collection layer, because you can move that concept of threat hunting, which was typically done at that layer, up to the advanced analytics layer within Exabeam. So just quickly looking through here, the Threat Hunter dashboard, you have your date range where you could start to look through here. If we think around activity types, so perhaps it's going to be around account management, account switching. We talked about VPN, perhaps it's going to be around that, again, given COVID and what's going on, you may be particularly interested in just looking around, generally around activity around VPN usage. You can bring in other elements to your threat hunting queries here as well. So it could be based around vendors, and these are vendors that we support just all straight out of the box. But again, if there's others that we don't have here, it's very easy to bring those in as well. We mentioned about the alert IDs. You can also start to bring in usernames. So if there's a particular user you want to look around activity, understand what perhaps they've been doing, or even if it's perhaps around maybe different classes of users. So we can learn who are your privileged users, again, perhaps through integration with directory services. So maybe you want to see what your C-class users are doing. Again, knowing about how targeted they are when it comes to phishing and spear phishing-like attempts. So you may want to keep a closer eye on their activity. And we can do the same for assets. So maybe if you start to group up and understand very critical asset services, maybe if there's some compliance or just types of services that hold very, very sensitive data, again, perhaps you want to keep a close eye on those so you can start to search and query against them. Look specifically around their activity. And then we have reasons. So something as well that we can start to now expose as well is if you're aligning yourself to MITRE and the attack framework, you can start to bring in those TTPs and start threat hunting using those. But also using Exabeam's own basically identifications and basically modeling and those rules that support that. We can now start, for example, taking first. Sometimes when you're threat hunting, very interesting to start seeing when you're seeing first-like activities. So here, for example, I may be particularly interested if there's ever a first access for an asset from a service account. Again, thinking about the type of permissions and privileges that service accounts hold. And again, you can start to bring geo information and network zones. Again, perhaps you're interested in activity that's going to be around DMZ and activity there. So just to quickly finish off, and perhaps let's bring an example in here. Maybe would be interested in looking at some specific events, say within the last month, and I do want to find perhaps users who aren't execs, but I am concerned that some non-executive users might actually be looking at accessing executive or privileged assets. I can easily do that just by starting to come into here. I can now start to look for my non-executive users. So here I've got a non-exec user log on to an executive asset. And then the other thing as well that I might be interested in, like I said, is if they're VPNing. We mentioned about using VPN and obviously how this, from an entry point into the network. Now, doing this type of query using a traditional SIEM and the queries that would need to be run to identify first, perhaps all the users that have accessed or used VPN over a time frame, perhaps over a month, would return X number, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of users. And then if you wanted to understand those users that perhaps have access an executive asset, we then need to start basically querying our Windows event logs. But combined to that, we'd also need to understand what are our executive assets. Again, we'd need to perhaps understand from a CMDB, I hope the CMDB is up to date, that it contains all of that information. But again, because Exabeam can learn who your executive users are, again, through directory integration, and that uses a host mapping that we can start to learn, say, what assets that they have and that they use, and basically, what they use on a day-to-day basis. That is completely automated for you as well. That level of intelligence and context has been built for you. So from an Exabeam point of view, all I now need to do is literally click on search. And here in this instance, I have one user that's been returned. So this one user has basically VPN'd in. We know that because obviously they'll query, and they've accessed basically an executive asset. Now, I could go and look at the timeline for that user, but suppose I've actually got several returns for this particular search. I can just click on the reasons. And here I can very quickly see all the abnormal behavior with the risk associated with it. Now, I also have the context of what they do for a job. Here we've got someone who works in IT. So it could be that all I now need to go and do is perhaps understand, was he called out? Was there an issue on a particular asset? And he was called out, and hence why the VPN access to that to that executive asset. I think what we'll do is we'll conclude the demo at that point, because I think I've given you hopefully a lot of information.
We wanted to put this slide back up just to reiterate how Exabeam is different from the normal way of responding to security alerts and different malicious activity or unusual activity. Instead of giving you that alert pile, we give you behavior analysis on your users and your entities in order to sort of immediately start seeing through the noise. And then once we've sort of given you what you actually need to be looking at, we help you decide which of those needs to be prioritized, pulling in automated timelines to give you all the information of what has happened across the different log sources and see all that activity in line, along with helpful descriptions of why that has been attributed this level of risk and why that's important, and maybe what kind of activity you might see around that as well in the descriptions. And then moving on to SOAR, which it was not in scope for this demo today, but as I said, we've got other people presenting on that as well. And being able to give you that capability in platform as well, so that you're able to sit all in one screen and not have that sort of swivel chair analyst problem where they're going and logging into lots of different tools to perform these different actions and then having to come back in and document them as well. So just allowing you to respond just so much faster and giving your analyst time to do those fun things like threat hunting instead of just trying to put out the alert fires as they go along.
First off, Al and Jess, thank you. That was really, really good. We've had a ton of questions come in. So hopefully we've got 14 minutes. So I think we should be able to get to everything. If you do have a question and you haven't asked it yet, please do pop the question in the Q&A and we'll get to as many of them as we can. First one is topical. So in the shift to remote working that's happened recently, how long would it take for the Exabeam advanced analytics to really baseline when everything's changed so rapidly?
That's a good question. So basically, the system is always learning. Once we create that baseline, it's not a case of that it's almost set in stone. So as more data comes in, then the models will learn and understand. Yep, suddenly users who are now working from home, they're VPNing in, that were never seen before. What would happen is, yes, there would be some anomalies generated for that specific activity because they VPN'd in. There'd be an element of risk. So but the point being is that we're not alerting perhaps just on that one behavior. as we kind of mentioned through the demo, what we're doing is we're aggregating risk across an entire session. So from that point, yes, the model will need to learn, and it will do that actually quite quickly, possibly even over just a few days with the data now flowing into it. But initially, what we'd start to see is some anomalies, there'd be some risk associated with it, but the rest of their activity would then be normal activity. So the user wouldn't even probably flag up, well, they wouldn't even flag up as notable. It's the reality of it. So, and then over time, obviously, the system does learn, and then that risk that had been identified for that new remote worker would then basically flatline out because it's now become normal behavior.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got another one here on models. How does Xbeam identify malicious activity if the model on which it is being trained to identify normal already contains malicious behavior?
I think that's probably going to be quite a similar answer to the one that Al said before, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So there's other things that are going on here within the rules themselves as well to basically identify that type of behavior. But again, it's one where basically the models will learn, they'll understand what is normal behavior, but it has to be taken in with the concept of actually looking at across all risk within inside the platform. So even if there is malicious activity being identified, obviously what's going on, there's going to be other activity associated beyond that as well that would then flag that up as notable ultimately as well, because you're not just dependent on one single activity type.
If they visited a malicious website, even if that was their normal behavior, they're still going to get quite a large amount of risk associated to that, which would probably end them up being a notable user, even if that's normally what they're up to.
How is Xbeam deployed? What is the architecture like? And what are the different options of deployment, either hardware or software?
Pretty flexible, actually. So there's on-premise appliances, if you wish. We also have a software-only version, which could be run on-premise as well, virtually. We also support things like running it as software-only in your own AWS instance, but also, and probably the biggest growth area that we're now seeing is SaaS. So where we actually provide the whole service for you, so that you don't have to be concerned about deploying clusters of data lakes or advanced analytics, etc., and the underlying. You can literally just feed it with the log data, and we provide that service for you there.
Okay, there's a follow-up question there then around, is there an option to have it as a managed solution like an MDR?
Yes, so that's one where, we absolutely have partners that help provide that type of service and managing it and working with customers to deliver that service as well. So absolutely.
I've got one here on ease of admin. So I answered this a little bit in the chat, but just for the purposes of everybody. So looking at the dashboards, it seems admin would have to normalize lots of events to make them fit in the dashboard's timelines. Correct me if I'm wrong. I want to understand ease of use for admin. Yeah, so the short version is the product does this automatically. Events are automatically parsed and enriched before they arrive in the timeline.
Exactly. And one of the things, like I said, obviously we were short of time, and I was whipping through quite a few bits. So forgive me if there were some bits that I missed out. And but you do have the option as well of filtering in the timelines. So we include, like I said, all the normal as well as the abnormal activity in that timeline. But as an investigation, it may be useful actually to remove that normal view, and you can do that. So you don't actually have a consolidated view of the anomaly and the risk associated in that timeline. So that would help you consolidate the view as well, if that's also what that question was referring to.
I think it's more around the administrative effort. I mean, I think one of the big benefits of our software is, from an admin point of view, it's not overly labour intensive.
No, a lot of it's largely, like I said, it's out the box. Pretty much everything that you saw there. There's no need to creation of rules or models themselves. Everything you saw in the timelines, that's completely automated and delivered. Just pretty much just straight out the box.
Well, a question on peer groups. So if you're creating peer groups based on AD and LDAP group, if you're doing something with entities and assets that are not listed in AD or LDAP, how do you build a peer group in that case?
So in that situation is, absolutely, we've got integration into directory services, but there's also APIs where you can build out what we call context tables as well. Pretty common term used in this situation. So you can populate those, as I said, using an API, or if you manually wanted to do it as well, either directly through a dashboard or CSV imports. It's another way of basically bringing in that information into the platform.
Brilliant. Okay, short question. Is there a trial version available? Yes, there is. So there is a form on our website. If you're interested in trying the product, you can get a free 30-day trial, fully functional, and the trial starts from when the logs are loaded in. So you're not losing any time waiting for everything to be loaded up. You're operational from day one. How long does it take to deploy XBeam? That's a bit of a piece of string question, but say if we're looking at the SIM, the full SMP, what would that look like?
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, sometimes it's easier to think about it the other way. If you already do have a SIM, we can basically integrate with those. We can augment those. So all of that functionality that you're seeing with Exabeam that we just ran through the advanced analytics, it can sit on top of your existing SIM. There's not a problem with that. And that actually, in terms of deployment and getting up and running, as I mentioned, a lot of that is just straight out the box. It's pretty straightforward. We would just take a feed of the log data to meet those use cases straight into AI. But yeah, absolutely, you can still do the full suite, so the SIM as well. With SIM and SIM collection, if you're, again, already familiar, it'd be a replacement. It's normally pretty straightforward task. It's probably just understanding and updating how log data is going to be forwarded across, or perhaps when it comes to Windows events, how they're going to be collected as well. With all of this, we've obviously got the team behind it to basically help you and our partners that are there to help you deploy. And it's obviously one of the reasons why we appear where we do on Gartner's Magic Quadrant is part around some of those services and basically helping customers getting value very quickly from Exabeam. But to your point, obviously, as well, Sam, that you mentioned, it's unique to each customer, but a lot of it, certainly when it comes to analytics, it is just straight out the box. You feed it the right log data, you'll get value very quickly.
That's a great plug for my session tomorrow at the same time tomorrow morning when we're talking about upcycling your SIM. So we actually talk about what that process looks like from end to end. There has been a question about Gartner. Good job you brought that up. As one of the follow-ups, we'll send out a link to the Gartner Magic Quadrant where Exabeam have been a leader for the last 3 years. So we can send that out. There's also a really good accompanying document that talks about critical capabilities that we can send out as part of a follow-up to this as well. I think we've covered everything that's been asked. Okay, there will be a recording of this session sent out. Our next session is at, I think, 1 p.m. Let me just check my list. And we'll be talking, it's Richard, Cassidy, and Steve, who will be talking about, where have I done with it? They've got a very long-winded title, which, if you've ever heard Richard talk, is about right, to be honest. So anyway, if you pop over to the live sessions link, you'll see it there. If you want to know a representative of what you've seen right now, the guys are live in the chat. We can have an SE jump on if you've got technical questions. We can demo any of the other systems that have been talked about if you're interested in seeing more. And if you are rushing to get back to your desk right now, as it were, then we can set up a meeting for a time that suits you well. Please do also check out the content that's available within the event website. And we also hope to see you very much on the happy hour tomorrow at 4 p.m. BST. With that, thank you very much again, Al and Jess. I hope everyone found it interesting. And we hope to see you on the next session. Cheers.